Vatican has received a formal invitation to visit Pyongyang from DPRK leader Kim Jong Un via the visiting South Korean President Moon Jae-in. It may be a giant step forward for peace on the Korean Peninsula. So what is behind the DPRK leader's Kim Jong Un's intention to invite the Pope to visit Pyongyang? How will the DPRK and the Vatican view the relationship between communist ideology and the Catholic faith? And what will it mean for the Korean Peninsula if Pope Francis finalizes his visit to the DPRK? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Xu Qingduo, who is a senior fellow at the Pango Institution. We will also speak to Francisco Sisi, a senior researcher at the China's People's University in Rome, and Joseph Kim, a CGTN correspondent in Seoul via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, Xi. What do you think of the possibility that the Pope will receive the invitation and pay an official visit to Pyongyang?
I think it is also a question for the Pope himself and, of course, his team to really think about. If you look at the historical precedents, let's say in the early 2000s, actually, Pope Paul II refused the invitation and refused to visit North Korea after he received a similar invitation. But this time around, we know there are some differences, like Pope Francis himself is different from Paul II. He is sometimes described as a socialist. He's probably more, it depends on up to himself whether to play a facilitator role for peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula, or he wants to wait for a while when the conditions are, I would say, ripe for him to visit not only in South Korea, possibly next year, and North Korea too.
The DPRK is often described by Western media as a hermit-like kingdom, and it's surprising, isn't it, that Pyongyang boasts of 10,000 Catholic followers. I mean, in this, what is called communist country, there are 10,000 people who believe in Catholic Church. How do you look at this?
I think it could be controversial, the figure itself, of course, because
there could be more. Is that what you mean?
Or much less. People say it could be a few hundred, and I mean, of course, North Korean leader Kim Jong Un can still sum up a welcome, like a ceremony, people along the street to welcome Pope Francis. If there's such a visit, there would be no problem. Of course, the key here is why he's asking or seeking such a visit. I think it's really about the visit will help to establish more the legitimacy of the young leader in North Korea, and also North Korea will be seen more as a normal country or as one of the member of the international community. Obviously, he's trying to open his own country to outside world, not only to the U.S. after his meeting with President Trump, but also with other leaders here.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Joseph, who's standing by in Seoul, ROK. Hello, Joe. Can you briefly assess the impact once Francis the Pope decides to accept the invitation and pays an official visit, the first of its kind by Vatican in decades since the end of the Second World War? And what does that mean?
Well, I think there's been a lot of points that were made in terms of the legitimacy of the DPRK leader Kim Jong Un's reign as the leader in the country. It also furthers the diplomatic push that the DPRK has made, not only meeting leaders from South Korea, the United States, as well as China, but now it's also a religious figure who is very revered throughout the world. We also know that from this, we saw Pope Francis broker deals between the U.S. and Cuba, so it could help relations between the DPRK and the United States. So there seems to be a lot of diplomatic channels that could open up through this visit if it happened.
We Chinese would be very surprised that such a visit could occur ahead of the Pope's visit to Beijing, in a way. But how do you assess the huge influence of the Catholic Church in the ROK in the first place?
Well, if we remember when Pope Francis visited East Asia. One of the first places he visited was South Korea. Now, even though South Korea may seem like a limited and small country for Catholicism, if we look at the inroads that the religion has made in terms of the democratic movement, as well as the importance it's had in terms of building the country for education, as well as other parts of this society, we know that it has had a large influence on the country, not just ideologically, but also through other aid efforts as well. So it does seem that this is a very important issue, especially given that the current president, South Korean President Moon Jae-in, also practices Catholicism. So that seems to be another point that many people are looking at.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Francis Sisci, our Italian guest speaker, who's now in Rome. Hello, Francis. What can you tell us about the background against which this invitation is delivered to the Pope via the South Korean President Moon Jae-in?
I think it is extremely important, of course, and this is meaning the two Koreas are in one mind. They want to peace, they want to advance peace, and they think the Holy See, the Vatican, the Pope, can help this peace process in Korea. And this is extremely significant because we knew that the Holy See played some role in all this talking in the past few years, but now we know that actually it played a positive role. It brought United States, South Korea, and also China together with North Korea. So if this message of peace is delivered to the Pope, and the Pope considers, we don't know if he can accept, he will not accept, this is, depends on many issues, but if he only considers it, it means that the Holy See can play a role in advancing peace in Asia.
Well, of course, if the Pope were to visit the DPRK, it could be a huge success for the charm diplomacy of Mr. Kim Jong Un, the paramount leader of the DPRK. Now, a few years ago, the Holy See visited the United States, and he was so critical of the greed of capitalists in Wall Street, particularly when he was talking about the 2008 financial tsunami that wreaked havoc with the world economy. Now, what do you think of the ideological relevance that may have prompted, the rapprochement and the improvement of the relationship between the Vatican and this communist government in Northeast Asia? Francis?
Well, the Holy See claims to be non-ideological, and it doesn't go into ideologies. It's a religious authority, and it tries to stay aloof with politics, with local politics. And this is an important gesture. The Pope was very worried about the possibility of an escalation, a war escalation in North Korea, around Korea. It played a role. We don't know if the Pope will go to North Korea also because of religious reasons. I mean, the Pope, when he visits any country, he has to have a missa, and then he has to meet the local Catholics. We don't know if Kim Jong Un would allow the Pope to celebrate a mass in North Korea, and also if they would allow the Pope to meet the local Catholics, if there are any Catholics. There were Catholics in North Korea before the Kim Jong-il, before Kim Il-sung, the grandfather, but we still don't know now if they are there and what kind of life they have. So
yes, indeed, the agenda of the Holy See in Pyongyang would be very interesting for us to follow. Having said this, Francis, what do you think of the role of Vatican's diplomacy in bringing about a peace. We still remember in the closing days of the Cold War what had happened in Poland. Pope John Paul II was a pope, and there was the movement by the Solidarity Union, and it seems that the Pope had helped avert bloodshed or severe crackdown upon the movement of the Solidarity Union, which eventually shaped the future of a new Poland in the aftermath of the Cold War. Now, do you think the Vatican has always shown great interest in politics and in particularly averting violence?
In that sense, is averting violence, definitely. I think you're right. The Pope played a huge role in avoiding a bloodshed in Poland. We also have to remember that Pope John Paul II, sometimes people don't remember, also played a role in helping out Cuba at the end of the Cold War in Europe, and Cuba was on the verge of collapse, and he played a huge offices, good offices in keeping the Castro power, and also later on with this Pope it helped normalizing relation with the United States. So the Vatican has always had a role for peace, a positive role for peace, and of course even more, I would say, with this Pope who is so projected into the world and so interested in Asia. So Asia is very dear to him, and is very keen on North Korea, and as we know, is also very keen on coming to China, and this normalization of relations with China was very, very important for him.
Right. The Holy See has visited Asia 3 times in my living memory.
Right. Can I offer slightly bit different opinions about how significant, I mean, possibly, if the visits becomes true to North Korea? I just see that, you know, it's, first of all, the idea, where is that from? At least there's speculation that's not really part of or originated from Mr. Kim Jong Un. It's possibly the idea of the South Korean president, Mr. Moon. You know, like he has this idea of like inviting Pope Francis to visit this country is really the purpose for promoting peace and stability between the 2 Koreas, and also to help denuclearize the arms in this peninsula. So that would be
to
a
help denuclearize and help diffuse the tensions.
Right. If you look at the past contribution by the Vatican, let's say, in the Cuba case, in the Poland case, remember both Poland and Cuba, they practice I mean, a lot of Catholics. North Korea, Asian countries are a bit different. Pope Francis visited Myanmar last year. A lot of people were paying attention to the Rohingya crisis over there. You know, after the visit, we can see the crisis still there. So maybe we cannot overstate the importance or significance of his visit. Yes, it helps. Yeah.
The Holy See currently maintains official ties with Taiwan, and do you think there are good reasons for the leader of Taiwan, Madame Jae-in, to follow very closely maneuvers by the Holy See in Northeast Asia, since there have been speculations of, you know, what's going to happen between Beijing and Vatican?
Yeah, I think obviously, I mean, Taiwan has more than enough reasons to worry about the situation, but you know, that's the rule, that's the law. Basically, every country is following, except a few, now only 17, and the Vatican is one of them. And I think, you know, Pope Francis basically expressed some idea like this. You know, you have to recognize, given how important China is, and China's importance is growing at the 2nd largest economy to be the largest probably in a few years' time. How is that possible? You continue to live in denial.
Right, let me go back to Joe. Joe, we are aware clearly of the growing momentum in the inter-Korean relationship at this moment, when leaders from both sides across the DMZ are considering seriously and proactively the possibility of not only signing peace agreement to apply finishing touches to one of the three major flashpoints in Northeast Asia. The other two, meaning the four, being the four northern islands, or Korean islands, and the Taiwan Strait, of course, when you look at legacy of the Cold War and the Second World War. So what do you think of the possibility that a peace agreement will finally be inked between the two sides?
Well, we heard from South Korean President Moon Jae-in, who said that perhaps signing a peace agreement with the DPRK will help things progress forward. But we know that between the two Koreas, the inter-Korean agreement that was signed at the third inter-Korean summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong Un did agree to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula, especially on the borders, and we're seeing the aftermath of that. We're seeing less military drills, and we're also seeing a movement of de-escalating tensions by removing artillery, as well as trying to remove the grenades from the DMZ. So it does seem that there is a momentum forward to try to bring peace along the border between the two Koreas.
Perhaps the charm campaign of DPRK's paramount leader Kim Jong Un has been seriously underestimated by the rest of the world, given the dynamics of his latest proactive diplomacy. Now, having said this, with the UN economic sanctions still in place, what's the margin for ROK and China to, assist with Pyongyang? We understand that Mr. Kim Jong Un is hungry with cash, with the investment, with perhaps reopening the cashing industrial park between the two Koreas. But it seems there is a strong limit to what can be done at this moment.
Yeah, it does seem that that is one of the areas in which South Korea has said that perhaps one of the ways that we can really try to get this peace process forward is for lifting of sanctions to try to entice North Korea to denuclearize. However, we've heard from the United States, who have been insistent that maximum pressure and sanctions policy is the reason that the DPRK came to the denuclearization table in the first place, and it doesn't seem that they're trying to let up. But South Korea has been going along recently to France and now to Italy, and has been asking for support from EU member countries to help with the denuclearization process. So we have to see whether or not there's going to be another summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un, and really see if there is any margin for or room for sanctions to be lifted.
Well, I don't want to deviate from the subject matter of the Holy See and the ramifications as a result. Now, let me ask you a question, Joe. Pope Francis visited South Korea in August 2014, where there is a vibrant Catholic community with some 5.5 million members, or just over 10% of the South Korean population. That's a lot. That is a lot. And no one underestimates the formidable presence of such Catholic followers in other parts of Northeast Asia. I'm not talking about China, by the way, but it seems some of the South Koreans are spreading gospels in China. I mean, can you brief us on the proactive religious activities of the priests from ROK? And of course, the Chinese authorities are not very happy about this.
In terms of the practices of ROK priests in China, we know that South Korea has been adamant in trying to spread the gospel. That's been one of the foundations of the church, as well as the religious sectors. So that does seem to be a motive on their part. However, if it is creating frictions between governments, I do think the South Korean government will have to look at it and try to have some open discussions with the religious sectors to try to see that it doesn't create diplomatic problems between South Korea and China.
And 2 South Koreans were killed in Afghanistan, so long as I'm concerned, a few years ago. And that, no, somehow they were held hostage, okay? And some of them came back and they apologized to the whole country of South Korea. Now, do you think such things are still going on? Because no one could possibly prevent the zealotry of the priests from spreading gospels in other parts of the world, even in the landlocked, war-torn country of Afghanistan. I mean, that's a very dangerous place, isn't it?
Yeah, we know that there's missions that are happening not just from priests in South Korea, but throughout the world, especially because given their philosophical beliefs in the Bible, that is one of the motives of what the Bible does entail. However, in terms of reports of whether or not this is happening in other parts of the country and whether ROK priests are involved in that, we haven't heard any reports as of lately. So in terms of what you speak of, it doesn't seem that there has been other reports of that happening.
All right, let me go back to Francis Sisi, our Italian guest speaker who's standing by in Rome. Are you hopeful that with the proactive go-between, if not shuttle diplomacy, between President Moon Jae-in and the United States, the process of denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula will have some kind of breakthrough in the near future?
Well, I don't know. The denuclearization is extremely delicate. China is working on it. South Korea is working on it. The Pope, of course, is very adamant about it. But denuclearization is extremely sensitive. Your guest just spoke about incentives. We don't know exactly what is going on with the talks. But let me add one point to the previous discussion. I think many times we don't make a difference between Christian missionaries and Catholic missionaries. South Koreans, for instance, have about 50% of the population which are Christians, but they are not Catholics. And some of these missionaries who go around the world are not Catholics. The Catholics try, of course, to spread the gospel, but actually, as it is clear also with Pope Francis, he tries to help. He went to Burma, to Myanmar, one of your guests said before, not just because he wants to change the faith of people in Burma, in Myanmar, but he wants to help the minorities, to help a democratic transition. So the Church thinks that what is really important is being of help. And in this case, what is paramount for the Pope and the Church is trying to bring all together all the different attentions, concerns, and worries. Many people are worried about the future of North Korea, and of course, denuclearization is important, and what kind of incentives can be given to Pyongyang in order to obtain this denuclearization.
Francis, there have been allegations that given the fact that Madam Jae-in, leader of Taiwan, refuses to accept the 1992 consensus about one China, he refuses to make any serious concessions, and now she enjoys the backing of Washington in this regard. So what do you think of the prospects of kind of normalizing the ties between Vatican and Beijing? Because we have heard a lot of stories about what is going on between Vatican and Beijing.
Well, ties have been normalized. There has been an agreement. They signed an agreement, and so ties have been normalized. However, the two sides, I mean, the Vatican and China, have not signed a diplomatic agreement, so they don't have diplomatic ties, state to state, but ties are normalized. I think at the moment it's better for all sides, but also for Beijing, to be extremely careful. We know next year there will be presidential elections in Taiwan. Things could go sour. It would be easy to rock the boat in Taiwan. In the past, 20 years ago, China tried to, Beijing tried to threaten Taiwan back to unity, and this didn't work. I think now the present leadership, Chinese leadership, is much more careful, much more cautious. It knows that they have to proceed with extreme care, not to scare Taiwanese, but also to try to move the sentiment back to one China. This is a hard process. I think the Holy See is also working towards this goal of reconciliation and the normalization of ties between Beijing and the Vatican. I think it could be a good sign and help this reconciliation also between Beijing and Taipei.
What do you think of this piece of advice from Francis concerning the cross-strait relationship?
Well, first of all, let me set things straight here. Cross-strait relationship between Beijing and Taipei had been very smooth. There's a lot of exchanges, business investment, and tourists both ways. Young people visit each other until 2016, when Madame Jae-in came to power, and she refused to recognize the 1992 consensus, which the foundation of which is really about one China. Both the mainland and Taiwan belong to the one China, which is a bit abstract, but there's room for both sides to interpret in a different way. So there's peace and stability, increased exchanges until 2016, until Tsai Ing-wen. Because of Tsai Ing-wen, because of the Taiwan, the situation, you see some tension over there. So I'm not sure Pope Francis will help. But at least, be realistic to recognize Beijing, to recognize China. Beijing is the sole representative, legal representative of China. There's only one China. That's the foundation for any diplomatic relationship with Beijing.
Have you heard or noticed any official response to President Moon Jae-in's current visit in Vatican and in its relationship, particularly with, the rapprochement between the two Koreas? The Chinese government has been supportive of whatever improvement of the relationship or restoration of peace and stability in Northeast Asia.
That's right. I think there's a key figure here, potential role to be played by the United States. We have to pay attention to whether the U.S. or Washington, D.C. is supportive of a visit by Pope Francis to North Korea. We know there's clear growing differences between South Korea and the United States in what way to deal with North Korea. For South Korea, the priority seems to be inter-Korea, peace and stability, reconciliation. But for the United States, there's only one issue, that is disarmament of nuclear weapons in North Korea. In terms of the pace, U.S. has been a bit impatient with South Korea's too fast approach with North Korea. So I think the U.S. is, basically Trump says, without my permission, South Korea will not go ahead.
No one knows what's going to happen between Washington and Pyongyang, given the enormous unpredictability of the presidency in the White House. We're going to see what happens on the sidelines of the G20 in Argentina between Beijing and Washington. If something could happen, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.